on Star 13.
And before we go tonight, if you hate dealing, Florida real estate lawyer Kenneth Jurinsky was very annoyed when negotiations on a $50 million real estate deal were interrupted by a stockbroker. Thanks for being with us. Have a great weekend.
This is a Nightline Friday night special.
It's August 4th, 1964.
We're going to retaliate, and we'll make an announcement a little later in the evening.
The Gulf of Tonkin slides the nation further into Vietnam.
What did we launch?
We launched 2 F-8 fighter aircraft, 2 A-4D.
The bodies of 3 missing civil rights workers are found in Mississippi.
Call the families and tell them that there'll be an announcement in the next 10 or 15 minutes. We'll, as soon as we get proper identification, let them know further.
And on the eve of his nomination, the president seriously considers not running for re-election.
The South is against me, and the North is against me, and the Negroes are against me. The press didn't really have an affection for me.
Tonight, the LBJ Tapes, a remarkable day in the life of a president.
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Aaron Brown.
By any definition, Lyndon Johnson was a complex man. Persuasive when he wanted to be, manipulative when he needed to be. Confident enough to seek the most powerful job in the world, and insecure enough to doubt he was up to the job. Historians tell us all these things about LBJ, but it is somehow different, more powerful, when you hear it from the man himself, and tonight you will. Johnson taped many of his calls and meetings, and another batch of those tapes was released today. They cover a brief period in the middle of the summer of 1964, almost exactly 33 years ago. Lyndon Johnson was in the early months of his presidency. The Civil Rights Bill had just been signed. There was hope and violence attached to it. The president had moved on to a political fight over his proposed war on poverty. A showdown there was coming, and in Southeast Asia, the war was building. Tonight, one day in that summer, August 4th, it was a day that changed the country and changed its president. An American ship had been shot at by North Vietnamese boats in the Gulf of Tonkin 2 days before. The administration, it's clear from the tapes, expected a second attack. The president's day began on the phone with his defense secretary. The war was about to escalate.
What I was thinking about when I was eating breakfast, but I couldn't talk it, I was thinking that looks to me like the weakness of our position is that we respond only to an action, and we don't have any of our own. But when they move on us and they shoot at us, I think we not only ought to shoot at them, but almost simultaneously pull one of these things that you've been doing, right, on one of their bridges or something.
Exactly. I quite agree with you, Mr. President. I'm not sure that the response ought to be as Admiral Sharp suggests.
Well, I'm not either. I don't know unless I knew what base it was and what was confirmed. But I wish we could have something that we've already picked out and just hit about 3 of them damn quick. Right there.
We will have that, and I talked to Mac Bundy a moment ago and told him that I thought that was the most important subject we should consider today, and be prepared to recommend to you a response, a retaliation move against North Vietnam in the event this attack takes place within the next 6 to 9 hours.
And now we better do that at lunch. There's some things I don't want to go in with these other. I want to keep this as close as I can. So let's just try to keep it to the two.
I will be prepared to do so at lunch.
All right.
At 11:06, the president's defense secretary, Robert McNamara, is back on the phone again, telling the president the North Vietnamese have attacked.
President, we just had word by telephone from Admiral Sharp that the destroyer is under torpedo attack. I think I might get Dean Rusk and Mac Bundy and have them come over here, and we'll go over these retaliatory actions. Then we ought to.
I sure think you ought to agree with that, yeah.
And I've got a category here. I'll call it to them.
Now, where are these torpedoes coming from?
Well, we don't know. Presumably from these unidentified craft that I mentioned to you a moment ago. We thought that the unidentified craft might include one PT boat, which has torpedo capability, and 2 SWAT boats, which we don't credit with torpedo capability, although they may have it.
What are these planes of ours doing around while they're being attacked?
Well, presumably the planes are attacking the ships. We don't have any word from Sharp on that. The planes would be in the area at the present time, all 8 of them.
Joining us throughout the program tonight to help us make some sense of these phone calls is LBJ historian Robert Dolick. Professor, did the president on August 4th know how significant the Gulf of Tonkin event was going to be in his presidency?
Well, he didn't know that it was going to lead to the kind of massive escalation that led him into a war that destroyed his presidency. But he certainly knew that this was a major statement on the part of the United States that the North Vietnamese had better desist from their aggression. And it had the potential for larger involvement.
Did he think it would end there?
He hoped it would end there. He hoped that this would be a signal to the North Vietnamese that they couldn't get away with aggression. But, of course, it didn't work out that way.
Stay with us. We'll come back to you in a moment. By late in the afternoon on August 4th, news of the incident in the Gulf of Tonkin had started to leak out. The president was concerned about leaks, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara was on the phone again.
Mr. President, the story is broken on the AP and the UP.
Yeah, it's fair.
And we've tried to track it down. Jim Greenfield talked to the AP, I understand, and was told it came from a source close to the Pentagon who was alleged to be a chairman of a congressional committee. I don't know what the source is, but anyhow, it's broken.
A long night was ahead. The reporters had the story of the attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. Speechwriters at the White House were preparing a national TV address by the president, and then the phone rang again. It was just a little bit after 8 o'clock. This time it was the FBI on the line. They had news of the 3 missing civil rights workers in Mississippi.
Mr. President?
Yeah.
Mr. Hoover wanted me to call you, sir, immediately and tell you that the FBI has found 3 bodies 6 miles southwest of Philadelphia, Mississippi, the 6 miles west of where the civil rights workers were last seen on the night of June 21st. Now, a search party of agents turned up the bodies just about 15 minutes ago while they were digging in the woods and underbrush several hundred yards off Route 21 in that area. We're going to get a coroner there right away, sir, and we're going to move these bodies into Jackson, Mississippi, where we hope they can be identified. We have not identified them as yet as the 3 missing men, but we have every reason to believe that they are the 3 missing men. They were at the site of a dam that had been constructed near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Wanted to let you know right away, sir.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Lexus.
By 8 o'clock on the night of August 4th, 1964, the president had his hands full. In just 2 hours, the U.S. would launch a major attack on North Vietnam and escalate the war. The FBI was pushing to make an announcement that it had found the bodies of the 3 missing civil rights workers in Mississippi. Events were moving faster than the president could control.
When are you going to make an announcement?
Within 10 minutes, sir, if it's all right with you.
All right. How are you going to make it? Where? From there?
I plan to make it from Washington here, sir.
All right.
This indicates the FBI has found 3 bodies but not identified them.
Okay, if you can hold it about 15 minutes, I think we'll notify these families.
At 8:35, another call. This time a better call.
There you are.
Darling,
Yes, beloved.
did you want me?
I just wanted to see you whenever you were all alone.
All right.
Just merely to tell you I loved you, that's
Will
all.
I be over there? The Russells still there?
No, they left at 3:30 this afternoon, dear.
Darling, well, why didn't they tell me to get back?
Because I guess they figured you just didn't have a moment.
Well, any other news?
Nothing embarrassing to yours, darling.
Trying to get some to go water, and I'll come over as soon as I get through.
Honey,
Yeah?
bring anybody who's a bachelor or who wants to eat or who would otherwise be doing without supper until real late with you, will you?
Okay.
Bye.
A 40-second break, then back to business. Texas Congressman George Meehan is on the phone. Vietnam, the topic.
What we've done, we're going to retaliate, and we'll make an announcement a little later in the evening, the next hour or so, and we'll probably ask Congress for a resolution tomorrow or next day to support us.
Oh, yes. Well, as you know, you'll get whatever you want.
But I don't know. I hope so. All these folks here said they'd go along tonight, so I guess it's all
I
right.
imagine everybody was
Yes.
fully sympathetic.
Well, Mike Mansfield wasn't. He thought we ought to get out of there. to stay away. He didn't want to fight anybody.
Yeah, well,
But Rush pointed out that that's the most dangerous course you could follow.
Yeah.
If you don't react when they shoot at your ships on the high seas 60 miles from shore,
You can't appear to be weak or appeasing on a thing when the issue is so clearly drawn.
they attacked us yesterday and they attack us again today.
Yeah. You're on the right track, Mr. President. And thanks so much for calling.
Okay, now tell me, what's happened to my poverty today?
LBJ historian Professor Robert Dallek joins us again. In this series of phone calls, we hear, with all of that is going on in Southeast Asia, the president asking all of these congressmen, what's this going to do to the poverty bill? He was nervous about the bill and was important to him?
Most important thing on his agenda. This was the heart of his presidency. The war on poverty, the Great Society. He wanted to be the greatest reform president in American history. He wanted to eclipse FDR. This was at the center of what he saw his presidency as.
And did he worry that Vietnam would destroy it?
He was worried that if he didn't fight in Vietnam, it would produce a McCarthyist reaction that would overwhelm his presidency. He was worried that if he did fight in Vietnam, it would so distract him that it would undermine the war on poverty and Great Society. In some ways, he felt he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. And it turned out to be exactly that way.
What effect is our asking Congress for a resolution to support us in Southeast Asia and bombing hell out of the Vietnamese tonight? What effect will that have on this bill? Will it kill it or help us?
It won't hurt us, but I just don't know. We'll hope not.
I think it'd be a little more reluctant to vote against this.
I would think so.
In Southeast Asia, the attack on North Vietnam was running late. The targets wouldn't be hit until midnight Washington time. The speech announcing the attack was scheduled for 10. LBJ was worried and on the phone with Bob McNamara again.
I'd sure as hell hate to have some mother say you announced it, my boy got killed.
I don't think there's much damage, much danger of that, Mr. President. How late would you be willing to hold the state?
I guess we could hold it till 11 o'clock news. I don't know. We don't have to make it, do we?
Oh, I think you need to make some kind of a statement of this kind, because tomorrow morning will be too late. Something will have to be on the news tomorrow morning, and it ought to come from you.
What do you think about it? I don't see why we bring Goldwater in on this. Why don't we just say I thought it appropriate just to communicate my decision to the Republican candidate for president? Not say he's assured me of his full support. I think it makes us sound like we're very much together and buddies and agreeing on bombing everybody.
Within an hour, Goldwater was found.
Hello? Hello? Barry? Yeah. I'm going to make a statement in a little bit, and I wanted to talk to you before I did. As President Commander-in-Chief, it's my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against U.S. ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply. Now, when I say the reply is being given, Barry, I may elaborate on that a little bit depending on how safe I can be at the time I deliver the statement. Do you follow me?
Yes, that's a good statement, Mr. President. I don't know what else you can do.
Well, we are just very confidentially, we are going to take all the boats out that we can and all the bases in which they come.
Well, I think it's proper action, and I think you've taken the right steps, and I'm sure that you'll find everybody will be behind you.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment
to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage. Yet our response for the present will be limited and fitting. We Americans know, although others appear to forget, the risk of spreading conflict. We still seek no wider war.
Professor Dallek, you see that speech, and you can't help but think that somehow this is the beginning of the personal destruction of LBJ.
Well, it was. Johnson starts down the road to escalation of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War destroys his presidency. His presidency was Lyndon Johnson. This is what his life was bound up with. And he leaves in 1968, or announces he won't stay on anymore, and it was the end of his career.
But what's remarkable, and as you will hear in a moment, even in August of '64, he was quite a tormented soul. That when we return.
It is a basic desire.
1964, in the midst of the Democratic convention in Atlantic City, all of LBJ's most vexing political problems seemed to be pressing in on him. His difficulties as a Southerner in building a coalition on civil rights, finding the right running mate, political infighting at the convention, and the disruptive tactics of the Kennedy forces. That morning in the Oval Office, after reading some hostile newspaper editorials, Johnson impetuously drafted an announcement that he was absolutely unavailable for the Democratic nomination for president. Just after 11 that morning, he called his press secretary, George Reedy, and read him the nearly complete statement, and then launched on a remarkable monologue full of resignation, wounded pride, and despair.
I don't want this power of the bomb, and I just don't want these decisions I'm being required to make, and I don't want the conniving that's required. I don't want the disloyalty that's around. I don't want the bumbling and the inefficiencies of our people, and all of them talk too much. And I'm absolutely positive that I cannot lead the South, the North, and the South. And I don't want to lead the nation without my own state, without my own section. I'm very convinced that the Negroes will not listen to me. They're not going to follow a white Southerner. And I think the stakes are too big to try to compromise. And there's just bound to be a lot of people that don't have these doubts, these angers, and these barnacles, and these things they have to carry, and the nation ought to have a chance to get the best available. That's who I want my children to have, and I know that I'm not.
George Reedy tried to buck up his boss's spirits by appealing to LBJ's instincts as a political battler.
I think it's too late, sir. I know it's your decision because you're the man that has to bear the brunt. But right now, I think this just gives the country the cold water.
Well, that's all right. I don't care. I just willing to. I don't think that. I don't agree with that fellow, but I think he can do better than I can.
He can't, sir. He's just a child. And look at our side. We don't have anybody.
I have a desire to unite people, and the South is against me, and the North is against me, and the Negroes are against me. And the press didn't really have an affection for me.
I think, sir, that to a certain extent you have to remember much worse things than that have been said about presidents, sir.
Well, that's
Abraham
right.
Lincoln was called a baboon.
That's right. I'm not debating.
No, I know that.
Whether they did or not, I know that. I know another Johnson sat in the same place and suffered more English than I'm suffering. But I don't see any reason why I need to.
Immediately after hanging up with Reedy, LBJ called senior White House staffer Walter Jenkins and told him of his decision. He began by wondering which of his rivals would win the nomination.
And I don't know who it'd be. I expect it'd be Bobby Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, whoever they are. But I believe they can get along with the Negroes better than I can. I don't see any reason why I ought to seek the right to endure anguish that I do endure. I don't know why I want that right. People, I think, have a mistaken judgment. They think I want great power. What I want is great solace, little love. That's all I want.
You have a lot more of that.
Well, I don't know. I don't think a white Southerner is the man to unite this nation in this hour. I have tried, and I've had doubts about whether a man born where I was born, raised like I was raised, could ever satisfy the Northern Jews, Catholics, Union people. Now, there are younger men and better prepared men and better trained men and Harvard educated men, and I know my own limitations. I just don't believe that I have the physical and mental strength to carry it. And I thought about it a good deal this morning. I have read the statement in 20 years, but I'm just getting ready to write this one. I just got one more sentence on it. I told them to have a helicopter stand by, and I'll decide during the lunch hour what to do about it.
It would be a letter from Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, that would convince him to accept the nomination. An extraordinary letter, as you will hear when we come back.
We really wanted to bring out the character of our home.
Which meant repainting everything.
Right now, Sears has every gallon of paint on sale, like this interior, just $4.99, or this...
President Johnson said years later that more than anything else, it was his wife who kept him from withdrawing from the race in 1964. He had shown her the statement that he'd written, had asked her for her reaction, and she immediately responded with a letter of her own. Extraordinary in a number of ways, not the least of which was its effect on history. Lady Bird Johnson read that letter for us tonight from her home in Texas.
Beloved, you are as brave a man as Harry Truman, or FDR, or Lincoln. You can go on to find some peace, some achievement amidst all the pain. You have been strong, patient, determined beyond any words of mine to express. I honor you for it. So does most of the country. To step out now would be wrong for your country, and I can see nothing but a lonely wasteland for your future. Your friends would be frozen in embarrassed silence, and your enemies jeering. I am not afraid of time or lies or losing money or defeat. In the final analysis, I can't carry any of the burdens you talked of, so I know it's only your choice. But I know you're as brave as any of the 35. I love you always. Bird.
Lady Bird Johnson, the wife of the 36th president. We'll have more from the just-released LBJ tapes on Monday night. That's our report for tonight. I'm Aaron Brown in Washington. For all of us at ABC News, good night.
I call it love. Movies touch us as few things can. Any technology that heightens the experience of watching movies at home makes life...
Be matched by the look on Dick and Jeannie's insurance agent when he gets that claim.
They ought to rename it the Dewdrop Inn.
Right.
That's our report tonight. Stay tuned now for Nightline.
And for Cheryl Fryer, Kimberly Harms, Ed Brandon, and Marvin Ziller, I'm Dave Ward. Thank you for being with us, and good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
July 21st, 1997.
As you see, the president is moving in a state of pandemonium exists out here.
It's the summer of 1964, and Lyndon Baines Johnson is running for president, but he's fighting with his rivals.
What I'm going to do, if they just keep on, I'm going to sock him right in the puss, and I don't want to do that.
His opponent.
What did you say yesterday about extremists?
Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
I'll just say extremism to destroy liberty is.
And even his running mate.
What are your plans now, sir, please? I plan on going up and making...
This boy, our friend Hubert, is just destroying himself with his big mouth.
Tonight, the LBJ tapes crossing a political minefield.
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Aaron Brown.
We've spent the last several days reliving the summer of 1964. A new batch of Lyndon Johnson's tapes were released, tapes of his phone calls, and they cover about 2 months in the middle of that summer. And what a summer that was. Race was the dominant domestic issue. The Civil Rights Bill was passed by Congress. There was some urban rioting in the North and plenty of race-related violence in the South. 3 civil rights workers had been kidnapped and murdered. Their bodies had been found in Mississippi. Abroad, the war in Southeast Asia was escalating. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed by Congress. And all of that took place in a few short weeks in the summer of '64, while the nation was still mourning the assassination of President Kennedy about 8 months before. For Lyndon Johnson, they were troubling times. The Democratic Convention and his nomination were just a few weeks away, and he was determined to resist the pressure to put his own Attorney General and President Kennedy's brother Robert on the ticket as Vice President. But he was also worried about the aura of the Kennedys when he called an old friend, Texas Governor John Connally, seeking advice on what to do about Bobby.
It just seems to me like that I ought to tell him that I'm not going to recommend to the delegation that they take him. But most of them think that he is determined that he wants this job, and he will do anything in the world he can to get it, and it's by causing the fight. He thinks that he can probably make me throw the election, and he'd like to see me a defeated man like Stevenson.
I feel very strongly about it, as you know, and I think you have to take Bobby on in a goddamn fight. Let's take him on. He's an arrogant, he's an egotistical, a selfish person that feels like he's almost anointed, and he is so power mad that it's unbelievable. And that's the very reason you can't take him on this ticket, because most people know it.
Neither of the two men, Johnson nor his Attorney General Robert Kennedy, liked or trusted the other very much. How strong the distrust can be heard in a conversation on the 21st of July. It started out as a discussion about security arrangements for a trip Martin Luther King Jr. was making to Mississippi. It ended up with Kennedy, the Attorney General, wondering what the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover were up to.
Hello, Mr. President.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King's going down to Greenwood, Mississippi tonight, and he's going to address a mass rally there. And of course, that creates a problem. It's a ticklish problem, because if he gets killed, it creates all kinds of problems. Just him being dead, but also a lot of other kind of problems.
Yeah. Can we have FBI people there and have them keeping their eyes and ears open and preceding him and following him probably?
Well, it's difficult just the preceding and following. Then I suppose we can. Again, I have no dealings with the FBI anymore, but I think maybe the Austin, perhaps they'll...
Didn't he get you that report the other day that he...
Yeah. But I understand that, he sends all kinds of reports over to you about me and about the Department of Justice.
Not any that I've seen. What are you talking about?
Well, I had understood that he had sent reports over about me.
No.
The overthrow of the government by force and violence.
No.
Leading a coup.
No, that's an error. He never has said that or indicated or given any indication of it.
LBJ historian Robert Dallek joins us tonight to help us make some sense out of what we've just heard. These two men, Kennedy and Johnson, had reason to distrust each other.
Well, indeed, they did. They had a long history of animus, of antagonism. Johnson was never going to take Bobby Kennedy as his vice presidential running mate. He simply did not want to be in a position of winning the presidency with the idea that Kennedy had helped him. He wanted to win on his own.
And if Bobby Kennedy felt the FBI was sending nasty things to the president about him, he had reason to be concerned about that.
Absolutely. He was greatly concerned that Johnson was going to try and drive him out of his administration. And so, of course, Bobby left and ran for the United States Senate.
By the end of July, LBJ had decided that Kennedy would not be his vice president. But how to tell him? That was on President Johnson's mind when he talked to advisor Clark Clifford on July 29th, a rehearsal for his meeting with Robert Kennedy.
This is Clark.
How are you, my friend?
Fine, friend.
I'm going to have that meeting today.
Yes, sir.
I've talked to one or two folks that have, he knows what it's about. He's suspected. But they think that it would be a mistake for me to ask him for any comment or any reaction or try to get any agreement other than just tell him this is my decision. Because they think if it did, it would mean a joining of swords right then and there. And this is the thing he wants more than anything else in his life. If he's denied it, it'll be very cruel and so forth.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any feeling about whether I ought to, he also wants to know who it is I'm selecting?
I have believed all along that all you do is tell him.
Yeah.
Now, I think it appropriate and courteous to give some reasons for your decision, but you are not asking him at any time for his reaction. I would not get into that.
But if you made the decision, what would you say?
When he says, have you made the decision? I have not made the decision, final decision as yet. And I'd let that stay just that way. But the one decision that you have made, you're telling him about, is the decision that it is not to be he.
As you will hear later, LBJ had reason to worry about how the Kennedys would react to the news. But first, when we come back, the dangerous politics of civil rights in the summer of '64. 17th, 1964, Lyndon Johnson was walking a tightrope. Just as Barry Goldwater's opposition to the Civil Rights Bill hurt him in the North, Johnson's support for the bill, he pushed it through Congress, hurt the Democrats in the South. Johnson wanted to be seen as a moderate, not a liberal on civil rights. He talked with aide Bill Moyers about the next day's news conference, how to deal with the race issue, and hate groups like the Klan.
Now, I rather think that you ought to give some serious consideration to making a statement in reply to a question tomorrow on the Klan. And it may be that we ought to talk about these pistol-packing, shotgun night riders that shoot people driving up and down the highway, and it's pretty good evidence that the Klan's mixed up in it. And we want to appeal to local authorities and state authorities to put an end to it. And it's got to be stopped, and the government's going to see it is. And then we might ought to make a little appeal to the Negroes and say we hope people be restrained. We've got a law now, and let us try it, let us have it work. Just as the night riders ought to be taking things in their hands, I hope that the people who feel that they've been aggrieved through the years could kind of also be restrained in their action. Not to say they can't demonstrate, or they can't petition, or they can't march.
Yes, sir.
But that they ought to likewise be restrained.
All right, sir.
Johnson would ask Moyers to have J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI prepare a strong statement linking the Klan with the hate crimes and the shootings in both Georgia and Mississippi.
Just say that we have evidence they've been associated with it.
All right, sir.
And we appreciate the cooperation we're receiving from state authorities. But the world ought to know that if these local constables and sheriffs, state authorities can't put a stop to it, well, we can, and it's just got to be done. We can't allow it. And that we ought to ask all of those that whose law is passed to protect, to give us a chance to put it in effect and to let up just enough hell raising to restrain themselves enough and give us a chance to do it. Now, you have to get a little spirit and a little God in there and a little church. And I think that we really ought to be on record as denouncing both of them, but doing it in the Klan in a pretty tough way, and all extremists. And what did he say yesterday about extremists?
He said, quote, extremism in the defense of liberty is not a vice.
Well, I just say extremism to destroy liberty is.
We don't believe the ends justify the means.
That's right.
Indeed, Johnson did meet with reporters the next day and did condemn the use of violence and terror by the clandestine hate groups, and did take his cue from Bill Moyers and finished up by saying, I am not one who believes that the end justifies the means. Professor Dallek, for one who remembers the Goldwater election as a landslide, was there really a concern that there were issues that Goldwater could hurt the Democrats on?
Yeah, absolutely. Johnson saw Goldwater as an extremist, and he used that very effectively against him in the campaign. But he was worried about civil rights, because this divided the Democratic Party, and it might be an explosive issue in the South. Not might, it clearly was an explosive issue in the South. There's a wonderful story about after the Civil Rights Bill passed, Bill Moyers came to see Johnson in his bedroom the next morning, found him in bed, surrounded by newspapers, announcing the great success of the civil rights legislation. Johnson was glum. Boys asked him, "Why are you so down in the dumps, Mr. President?" Johnson responded, "Because, Bill, I think we may have given away the South to the Republican Party as far into the future as any of us can see."
And in fact, all the president's political strategists, including Robert Kennedy, were concerned about what civil rights might mean to the campaign. Listen to this conversation between the president and Robert Kennedy, where Kennedy, this champion of civil rights, urges the president to avoid the subject, not debate Goldwater on civil rights in the campaign ahead.
I think, Mr. President, it makes just a major mistake to let him choose this battleground now and have it this struggle and this election over the question of civil rights. And because I know if it comes down to the question of civil rights, Democrats are going to have a very tough time. I think we got to get it off that.
Yes,
that question.
Of course, the difficulty, what we need to get it on is his impetuousness and his impulsiveness and his wanting to turn the bomb over to somebody else.
Yeah.
But I certainly agree with you. Civil rights is
not our
there's something around our neck.
If there is a tape of that meeting, it's never been released, so we don't know exactly what was said at that meeting. What we do know is what LBJ told his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, later about the conversation with Kennedy.
I said, I want you to know that I've been concerned about a matter that's of interest to you and to me. I've concluded you should hear it from me direct first. I've reached the decision that it would be inadvisable for you to be a candidate for the number 2 spot this year. I feel like that this is not the time for you, if you have ambitions to lead the country, to go after this spot. I want you to direct the campaign. I want you to do anything else that you'd like to do. I need your help. I think you're brilliant. I think you're dedicated. I think that you're good for the country. I think you'll be good for me. We need it. And he said, well, I want to help any way I can the rest of the campaign. I don't know what to do after that. He got up, walked to the door, and got the door turned around and said, well, I could have been a hell of a lot of help to you. If you'd asked my opinion, I would have told you that I could have been a hell of a lot of help to you. And meaning if you'd gone on the ticket, I assume. I looked that way, and I said, well, you are going to be a hell of a lot of help to me. In the way I've outlined it. And then I hesitated a moment, and he smiled, and I smiled, and I said, a hell of a lot of help to yourself.
LBJ was right to be worried about how the Kennedy decision would play. Johnson believed that Kennedy himself was planning stories in the press about what a mistake Johnson had made, and the president wanted it stopped. He turned to Larry O'Brien, a Kennedy friend and a Johnson aide, and he read him one of the offending news stories.
I'm getting a barrage of unnecessary heckling and harassing today from Hyannisport. Attorney General Kennedy received a barrage of telephone calls and messages from supporters angered at the manner in which the president eliminated him as a Democratic candidate. Informed sources said the callers, backers of the Attorney General and the late President Kennedy, asked the Attorney General what their next move should be.
That's Hyannisport Dateline?
Yes, sir.
My God.
And ain't nobody knows about the barrage of calls without his knowing it.
Well, I'll have to agree there.
Now, will you don't think about that, because what I'm going to do, if they just keep on, I'm going to sock him right in the puss, and I don't want to do that.
By now, Johnson was leaning towards Hubert Humphrey, and as you can tell in this conversation with labor leader Walter Reuther, there was much Johnson admired about the Minnesota senator.
If we have a problem, I have a good mind just turn Hubert loose, by God, and let him see him, because nobody sees him but what likes him. He's a laughing fellow. You can't insult him. He just smiles you out of the room, and he's logical as hell, and he's eloquent as hell, and he's for the poor man, and that's where you got a lot of poor people.
Hubert can do that job, Mr. President, better than anybody else, and he'll go out and work his heart out.
But LBJ was not always so full of praise. 5 days later, he got this call from James Rowe, an old friend and an advisor. It seems Humphrey had told an NBC reporter about a sensitive and secret communications with the Russian government. He'd leaked it, and the president was enraged.
I don't know. I don't know how to get this message over, but this boy, our friend Hubert, is just destroying himself with his big mouth.
Are you talking again?
Yeah, all the time. You just got to understand that you can't talk about war plans. You just can't talk about it. Now, this morning, that fellow called me very upset, one of the highest officials in the government, and said, have you talked to Humphrey about a communication from Khrushchev? And I said, no. Well, Humphrey has discussed the details of communications with Khrushchev that somebody must have let him know about, and with a correspondent for NBC. And it's the one thing that could make Khrushchev drop a bomb on us. And he just ought to keep his goddamn big mouth shut on foreign affairs, at least until the election's over.
Despite his misgivings, Johnson did select Humphrey in the end.
My long time my trusted colleague, Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota.
They were now a team, Johnson and Humphrey, although neither man could have known then how the events of that summer, the summer of '64, the racial unrest at home, the escalating war in Southeast Asia, would change the country and change history's view of them. In a moment, no doubt about who wore the pants in the Johnson White House. There's one other thing we should tell you about this batch of LBJ tapes. They aren't all about politics and policy. One of them is about pants, trousers. The president needed new pants. So he called Joe Hager, as in Hager slacks, and he ordered them as only he could.
Mr. Hager?
Yes, it's Joe Hager.
Joe, is your father the one that makes clothes?
Yes, sir. We're all together.
You all made me some real lightweight slacks that he just made up on his own, sent to me 3 or 4 months ago. Now, I need about 6 pairs for summer wear.
Yes, sir.
I want a couple, maybe 3 of the light brown, kind of a almost powder color, like powder on a lady's face. I want them half an inch larger in the waist than they were before, except I want 2 or 3 inches of stuff left back in there so I can take them up. I vary 10 to 15 pounds a month. All right. Now, the pockets, when you sit down in the chair, the knife and your money comes out, so I needed at least another inch in the pockets.
Fine.
Yeah. Now, another thing, the crotch is always a little too tight. So when you make them up, give me an inch that I can let out there, because they cut me. They're just like riding a wire fence. These are the best that I've had anywhere in the United States. But when I gain a little weight, they cut me under there. So leave me, you never do have much margin there. Let's see if you can't leave me about an inch from where the zipper ends.
All right, sir.
Now, be sure you got the best zippers in them. These are good that I have. And if you get those to me, I would sure be grateful.
Where would you like to stand, please?
The White House?
White House. That tape, like all the rest, vintage LBJ. And that's our report for tonight. I'm Aaron Brown in Washington. For all of us at ABC News, good night.
Nightline is always on with abcnews.com, on the web or AOL. If you'd like a transcript or video cassette of this or any other edition of Nightline, please call 1-800-CALL-ABC.
Nightline has been a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source. ABC News, now always on.
New York Newsday. Tonight, the LBJ tapes. A remarkable day in the life of a president.
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Aaron Brown.
By any definition, Lyndon Johnson was a complex man. Persuasive when he wanted to be, manipulative when he needed to be. Confident enough to seek the most powerful job in the world, and insecure enough to doubt he was up to the job. Historians tell us all these things about LBJ, but it is somehow different, more powerful, when you hear it from the man himself, and tonight you will. Johnson taped many of his calls and meetings, and another batch of those tapes was released today. They cover a brief period in the middle of the summer of 1964, almost exactly 33 years ago. Lyndon Johnson was in the early months of his presidency. The Civil Rights Bill had
reactions, then we ought to. I sure think you ought to agree with that, yeah. And I've got a category here. I'll call it to him. Now, where are these torpedoes coming from? Well, we don't know. Presumably from these unidentified craft that I mentioned to you a moment ago. We thought that the unidentified craft might include one PT boat, which has torpedo capability, and 2 SWAT top boats, which we don't credit with torpedo capability, although they may have it. What are these planes of ours doing around while they're being attacked? Well, presumably the planes are attacking the ships. We don't have any word from Sharp on that. The planes would be in the area at the present time, all 8 of them.
Joining us throughout the program tonight to help us make some sense of these phone calls is LBJ historian Robert Dolick. Professor, did the president on August 4th know how significant the Gulf of Tonkin event was going to be in his presidency?
Well, he didn't know that it was going to lead to the kind of massive escalation that led him into a war that destroyed his presidency. But
quite agree with you, Mr. President. I'm not sure that the response ought to be as Admiral Sharp suggests. Well, I'm not either. I don't know unless I knew what base it was and what it's confirmed. But I wish we could have something that we've already picked out and just hit about 3 of them damn quick. Right. We will have that, and I talked to Mac Bundy a moment ago and told him that I thought that was the most important subject we should consider today, and be prepared to recommend to you a response, a retaliation move against North Vietnam in the event this attack takes place within the next 6 to 9 hours. And now we better do that at lunch. There's some things I don't want to go in with these other. I want to keep this as close as I can. So let's just try to keep it to the two. I will be prepared to do so at lunch. All right.
At 11:06, the President's Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, is back on the phone again, telling the President the North Vietnamese have attacked.
President, we just had word by telephone from Admiral Sharp that the destroyer is under torpedo attack. I think I might get Dean Rusk and Mac Bundy and have them come over here, and we'll go over these retaliations.
Star 13.
And before we go tonight, if you hate dealing, Florida real estate lawyer Kenneth Jurinsky was very annoyed when negotiations on a $50 million real estate deal were interrupted by a stockbroker. Thanks for being with us. Have a great weekend.
This is the Nightline Friday night special.
It's August 4th, 1964.
We're going to retaliate, and we'll make an announcement a little later in the evening.
The Gulf of Tonkin slides the nation further into Vietnam.
What did we launch? We launched 2 F-8 fighter aircraft, 2 A-4D.
The bodies of 3 missing civil rights workers are found in Mississippi.
I'll call the families and tell them that there'll be an announcement in the next 10 or 15 minutes. We'll, as soon as we get proper identification, let them know further.
And on the eve of his nomination, the president seriously considers not running for re-election.
The South is against me, and the North is against me, and the Negroes are against me. The press didn't really have that.
Had just been signed. There was hope and violence attached to it. The president had moved on to a political fight over his proposed war on poverty. A showdown there was coming, and in Southeast Asia, the war was building. Tonight, one day in that summer, August 4th, it was a day that changed the country and changed its president. An American ship had been shot at by North Vietnamese boats in the Gulf of Tonkin 2 days before. The administration, it's clear from the tapes, expected a second attack. The president's day began on the phone with his defense secretary. The war was about to escalate.
What I was thinking about when I was eating breakfast, but I couldn't talk it, I was thinking that looks to me like the weakness of our position is that we respond only to an action, and we don't have any of our own. But when they move on us and they shoot at us, I think we not only ought to shoot at them, but almost simultaneously pull one of these things that you've been doing, on one of their bridges or something.
Exactly. I